Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode: Jenn Kamp loses her anti-stalking petition against John Dehlin. Today's date is March 8th, 2023. It is now 7 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast. I have just received word that Judge Coral Sanchez, the judge who presided over the hearing yesterday on March 7th, 2023 in downtown Salt Lake City in 3rd District Court, has issued her ruling complete with findings of fact and conclusions of law regarding the 4-hour hearing that was held yesterday in her courtroom, where Jenn Kamp, former employee at Open Stories Foundation, was requesting the court to issue an anti-stalking order against John Dehlin. I have just now received a copy of that order, which is public record, and I'm going to read it for you right now. Okay, here we go. In the 3rd Judicial District, State of Utah, in and for Salt Lake County, Jennifer Ruth Kamp petitioner versus John Dehlin respondent. Order in case number 23-090-1037, Judge Coral Sanchez. Pending before the court is Jennifer Ruth Kamp's ex parte civil temporary stalking injunction against John Dehlin. By the way, ex parte just simply means that she got the temporary order a few weeks ago with only herself showing up and only presenting her side of the evidence. The other party, John Dehlin, was not present. That's what ex parte means. So, once again, pending before the court is Jennifer Ruth Kamp's ex parte civil temporary stalking injunction against John Dehlin. The court has reviewed all of the pleadings and has considered the admitted evidence and arguments of the parties at an evidentiary hearing held on March 7, 2023 at 9 o'clock a.m. related to an ex parte temporary civil stalking injunction issued on February 14, 2023. For the reasons stated below, the ex parte temporary civil stalking injunction is hereby revoked. Findings of fact. 1. Jennifer Ruth Kamp, the petitioner, and by the way, where it says petitioner, I'll probably just say Jenn Kamp, and where it says respondent, I'll probably just say John Dehlin throughout in order to keep it as clear as possible. Jennifer Ruth Kamp began employment as the Director of Operations at the Open Stories Foundation, OSF, on February 6, 2022. John Dehlin, the respondent, is the registered agent of OFS and a member of the Open Stories Foundation Board of Directors, also called the Board. OSF, Open Stories Foundation, conducted a popular podcast called Mormon Stories. Respondent John Dehlin is the host of the podcast and has a large following. Typically, John Dehlin hosted the podcasts. Each podcast typically had the participation of a co-host to aid John Dehlin conducting the podcast. The co-host varied from podcast to podcast. Initially, Jenn Kamp's job duties were limited to picking up mail and performing miscellaneous office work. Later, Jenn Kamp learned how to do payroll, and that became one of her job duties. A few months after Jenn Kamp started her employment with OSF, Jenn Kamp began co-hosting podcasts with John Dehlin. Jenn Kamp was one of several co-hosts. Some of the podcasts were live and others were recorded to be aired at a future date. Jenn Kamp enjoyed participating in podcasts and was doing a good job in her podcast co-hosting role. Approximately in June or July, that would be of 2022, Jenn Kamp participated in a podcast with host Christine Burton. The podcast was recorded. The podcast was focused on child sexual abuse. In the podcast, Jenn Kamp told the host that she had personal stories about abuse. Jenn Kamp believed that the podcast was not supposed to be broadcast. The podcast was later broadcast. Approximately in June or July, Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin agreed to have Jenn Kamp conduct her own podcast with a group of guests. The podcast was recorded. The podcast had a total of 4 women participating and was focused on female body autonomy. During the podcast, Jenn Kamp shared the details of sexual abuse they experienced as children. The other podcast participants also shared the details of traumatic events of abuse they experienced. Yes, I know that doesn't flow exactly right, but that is the language of the order. John Dehlin did not listen to the entire podcast as it was being recorded, but periodically checked in to make sure that there were no technical issues with the recording. Jenn Kamp asserts that she never intended the podcast to be aired and only used it as a practice podcast. However, a week after Petitioner recorded the podcast focused on female body autonomy, Jenn Kamp sent John Dehlin a text that included the podcast on female body autonomy in a list of recorded podcasts that she suggested should air. Additionally, it is unlikely that a group of participants would gather together in a podcast setting and that John Dehlin or Jenn Kamp would be concerned about any technical issues with the podcast if the podcast was a practice session that would never air. Good point, Judge. Prior to August 10th, 2022, Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin agreed to have a special series of podcasts where Jenn Kamp would discuss details of the sexual abuse she suffered as a child. Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin planned to approach the subject in a series of 4 podcasts. On August 10th, 2022, Jenn Kamp, John Dehlin, and another male hosted a live podcast about sexual abuse involving the LDS Church and the Boy Scouts of America. The podcast was also recorded. During the podcast, John Dehlin made a statement to the effect of, "I know this is a topic that is important to you when discussing child sexual abuse." Jenn Kamp was bothered by this and felt outed. After the podcast ended, Jenn Kamp expressed her discomfort to John Dehlin. John Dehlin offered to edit out the part of the recording discussing Jenn Kamp's child sexual abuse, but Jenn Kamp said no. On August 22nd and 23rd, 2022, Jenn Kamp did a podcast where she disclosed the details of the child sexual abuse she suffered. John Dehlin was the host, and John Dehlin's wife was the co-host. The podcast was broken up into 4 separate podcasts, and all were recorded. Jenn Kamp was allowed to take 2 days off after the podcast. Jenn Kamp opted to take 1 day off and work from home the second day, which was August 25th, 2022. On August 25th, 2022, Jenn Kamp was working from home. John Dehlin contacted Jenn Kamp to inform her that he needed to meet with her at the office. Jenn Kamp was upset that she had to go into the office and rearrange her day. When she and John Dehlin met, Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin got into an argument. On August 25th, 2022, Jenn Kamp texted Clint Martin and Carrie Whitbeck, both members of the board. Jenn Kamp expressed her concerns about John Dehlin asking her to come into the office on a day she was scheduled to work from home. Mr. Martin and Ms. Whitbeck organized a meeting for August 30th, 2022 to address Jenn Kamp's concerns. Jenn Kamp, John Dehlin, Mr. Martin, and Ms. Whitbeck attended the August 30th, 2022 meeting. The meeting was held virtually and recorded. Jenn Kamp spoke for 60 to 70% of the duration of the meeting. During the meeting, John Dehlin brought up concerns about Jenn Kamp's poor job performance and Jenn Kamp's use of private information that she had access to in order to support a salary increase for herself. During the August 30th, 2022 meeting, Jenn Kamp asserted that she felt threatened and scared during the August 25th, 2022 meeting. Oops, it says 2023 here. I think that's another typo. But once again, Jenn Kamp asserted that she felt threatened and scared during the August 25th meeting because John Dehlin yelled at her and was threatening her. Jenn Kamp told Ms. Whitbeck and Mr. Martin that John Dehlin was aggressive, kept standing up, and made threatening gestures. Jenn Kamp also told Ms. Whitbeck and Mr. Martin that she loves working with John, quote unquote, and that she and John Dehlin make a great team. After the August 30th, 2022 meeting, Mr. Martin and Ms. Whitbeck were concerned by Jenn Kamp's allegations and pulled a video from a camera that captured the August 25th, 2022 meeting between John Dehlin and Jenn Kamp. In reviewing the video footage, Mr. Martin did not observe John Dehlin engage in any threatening behavior. On the contrary, Mr. Martin observed that Jenn Kamp yelled and engaged in insubordination. Mr. Martin noted that John Dehlin remained calm in light of Jenn Kamp's behavior toward John Dehlin. After observing the video, Mr. Martin felt that Jenn Kamp misrepresented to him what occurred at the August 25th meeting. In reviewing the video, Ms. Whitbeck did not observe John Dehlin act aggressively toward Jenn Kamp. Ms. Whitbeck concluded that the video footage contradicted Jenn Kamp's allegations and felt that Jenn Kamp misled her. On August 31st, 2022, when Jenn Kamp was still employed by OSF, John Dehlin texted Jenn Kamp. In his text to Jenn Kamp, John Dehlin requested to have a conversation with Jenn Kamp before the board made a decision about Jenn Kamp's employment. Jenn Kamp did not respond to John Dehlin's text. On September 2nd, 2022, the board terminated Jenn Kamp's employment with OSF. On September 10th, 2022, John Dehlin sent a video to Jenn Kamp via text and email. The contents of the text message and email are identical, and both contain the same video attachment. In his email and text message, John Dehlin expressed his desire to reconcile with Jenn Kamp. The video contains a lengthy message from John Dehlin to Jenn Kamp where he expresses his wish to reconcile with Jenn Kamp. On September 11th, 2022, Jenn Kamp sent John Dehlin and the board a message asking that John Dehlin and members of the board stop all communications with Jenn Kamp. After receiving Jenn Kamp's September 11th, 2022 request to stop all communications, John Dehlin stopped all contact with Jenn Kamp. On January 17th, 2023, Jenn Kamp filed a lawsuit against John Dehlin and members of the board. On February 7th, 2023, John Dehlin filed a lawsuit against Jenn Kamp. On February 12th, 2023, Jenn Kamp, who now has her own podcast, broadcasted a live recording on her Instagram account. During the broadcast, Jenn Kamp noticed that John Dehlin logged on. John Dehlin, who was attempting to collect evidence for his lawsuit, logged off as soon as he realized that the video was live and not a recording. On February 14th, 2023, approximately 4 people at Jenn Kamp's place of employment received an email that contained a video of the August 30th board meeting and a copy of the complaint in John Dehlin's lawsuit. There is no evidence that John Dehlin was directly or indirectly involved in sending the email to Jenn Kamp's workplace. On February 14th, 2023, Jenn Kamp applied for a temporary civil stalking injunction, and the injunction was granted. On February 17th, 2023, John Dehlin filed a request for a hearing to address the temporary civil stalking injunction. Since her employment was terminated at OSF, Jenn Kamp has publicly discussed the August 25th, 2022 meeting with the board. Again, I think the order has the date wrong. It was August 30th of 2022 that the board meeting was held. The August 25th meeting was just between John Dehlin and Jenn Kamp. And her pending lawsuit numerous times on different podcasts and social media channels. Since her employment was terminated at OSF, Jenn Kamp has publicly discussed on various social media platforms allegations against John Dehlin involving claims of sexual harassment involving other females that Jenn Kamp has no personal knowledge of. No evidence was presented that John Dehlin directed a third party to contact Jenn Kamp or discuss matters related to Jenn Kamp. Specifically, there is no evidence that John Dehlin directed or influenced Radio Free Mormon to discuss any matters related to Jenn Kamp. There is no evidence that John Dehlin was the person who leaked the recording of the August 25th, 2022 meeting. There is no evidence that John Dehlin was the person who leaked the recording of the August 25th, 2022 meeting. I think that may be another typo by the judge. I think she means the August 30th board meeting. There is also, there is no evidence that John Dehlin provided the recording of the August 25th, again, I think that should be the August 30th board meeting, to Mormon Discussions, Inc., or that John Dehlin directed them to broadcast the recording on February 9th, 2022. Yes, it is definitely the board meeting that's being referred to here from August 30th, not August 25th. The link to the video is part of a complaint, a readily accessible public court document, which was filed on February 7th, 2023. So in other words, it was filed 2 days before it was put up at Mormon Discussions, Inc. Conclusions of law. So those are the findings of fact that the judge has made. Now the conclusions of law based upon those findings of fact. Since John Dehlin requested a hearing in writing within 10 days of being served with the ex parte civil stalking injunction, the burden is on the petitioner, Jenn Kamp, to show by a preponderance of the evidence that stalking of Jenn Kamp by John Dehlin occurred. The standard that the court must apply is an individualized objective standard. The burden is on Jenn Kamp to show by a preponderance of the evidence that John Dehlin engaged in a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person in Jenn Kamp's circumstances to suffer emotional distress. In applying this individualized objective standard, it is helpful to look at the factors identified in Baird v. Baird. The court finds the following. Prior to August 25th, 2022, respondent and petitioner, i.e. John and Jenn, enjoyed a healthy work relationship. There was no history of abuse between Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin. Jenn Kamp and John Dehlin enjoyed a mutually beneficial relationship. John Dehlin benefited from Jenn Kamp co-hosting podcasts with him because they were popular with OSF's audience, and Jenn Kamp gained experience and was encouraged by John Dehlin to pursue a goal of hosting podcasts individually. At the August 30th, 2022 board meeting, okay, now the date's correct. At the August 30th, 2022 board meeting, Jenn Kamp described to the board that she and John Dehlin were a great team and that she loved working with John Dehlin. Jenn Kamp was understandably sensitive about the trauma she endured as a child. Although it was insensitive of John Dehlin to disclose that Jenn Kamp was a victim of child sexual abuse during the August 10th, 2022 podcast, John Dehlin did not disclose the information in an effort to exploit Jenn Kamp's vulnerability. Jenn Kamp had already agreed to do a multi-part podcast with John Dehlin detailing her child sexual abuse and had already recorded a podcast where she insinuated that she was a victim of child sexual abuse. In reviewing footage of the podcast, the court finds that John Dehlin was attempting to promote the upcoming podcast about Jenn Kamp's child sexual abuse rather than exploiting Jenn Kamp's vulnerability about her experience as a victim of that sexual abuse. The alleged stalking occurred via electronic communication. None of the alleged stalking occurred physically near Jenn Kamp's home or her children. The court finds that the text messages John Dehlin sent prior to her termination on September 2nd, 2022 were work-related and geared towards improving the work relationship between John Dehlin and Jenn Kamp. Jenn Kamp did not present evidence that directly or indirectly ties John Dehlin with any statements or publications made by Radio Free Mormon or Mormon Discussions, Inc. Therefore, these statements or publications are not relevant to the court's determination of whether John Dehlin engaged in a course of conduct pursuant to certain sections of the code. In other words, a course of conduct that would qualify under the law as stalking behavior. Jenn Kamp did not present evidence that directly or indirectly ties John Dehlin to the email sent to Jenn Kamp's place of employment on February 14, 2023. Therefore, the email is not relevant to the court's determination of whether John Dehlin engaged in a course of conduct. The almost identical but separate text and email messages and video attachment that John Dehlin sent Jenn Kamp on September 10th constitute a course of conduct as defined by the statute. Utah's stalking statute defines course of conduct as two or more acts directed at or toward a specific individual, including acts in which the actor communicates to or about an individual directly by any action, method, device, or means. By communication directly with Jenn Kamp twice via an electronic device, John Dehlin's conduct falls within the parameters of the course of conduct definition. However, to violate this section, an actor must intentionally or knowingly engage in a course of conduct directed at a specific individual, and the actor must know or should know that the course of conduct would cause a reasonable person to fear for the individual's own safety or the safety of a third individual or to suffer other emotional distress. Jenn Kamp has not met her burden of demonstrating that the messages John Dehlin sent her would have caused a reasonable person in Jenn Kamp's circumstances to fear for the individual's own safety or the safety of a third individual or to suffer other emotional distress. In the messages, John Dehlin expressed his desire to reconcile with Jenn Kamp. There were no implicit or explicit threats, no strong language used, no blackmail, or no verbiage used that would cause a reasonable person in Jenn Kamp's circumstances to fear for her safety. Less than 3 weeks before, Jenn Kamp publicly expressed that she loved working with John Dehlin and that she and John Dehlin were a great team. Jenn Kamp asserts that receiving the electronic communications in light of John Dehlin's past behavior towards her caused her to fear for her safety and caused her emotional distress. Although Jenn Kamp alleges that John Dehlin was abusive when she met with him on August 25, 2022, Mr. Martin's and Ms. Whitbeck's testimony contradicts those allegations. Other than Jenn Kamp's allegations involving John Dehlin's behavior on August 25, 2022, which the court gives little to no weight because of credible, conflicting testimony, no other evidence was presented that supports by a preponderance of the evidence that John Dehlin's conduct towards Jenn Kamp would cause a reasonable person in Jenn Kamp's circumstances to fear for her safety or cause Jenn Kamp to experience significant mental or psychological suffering. In reviewing evidence regarding John Dehlin's appearance on Jenn Kamp's Instagram live video, the court finds that John Dehlin believed that he was about to watch a video published by Jenn Kamp in an attempt to collect evidence for his pending lawsuit. When John Dehlin realized that the video was live, John Dehlin quickly logged off. Prior to this incident in February 2023, John Dehlin had not contacted Petitioner since September 11, 2022, when Jenn Kamp requested that John Dehlin stop all communications with her. Even if this evidence is considered as part of the course of conduct involving the September 10, 2022 electronic messages John Dehlin sent Jenn Kamp, the court finds that John Dehlin's course of conduct would not cause a reasonable person in Jenn Kamp's circumstances to suffer significant mental or psychological suffering. It is clear that since OSF terminated Jenn Kamp's employment, John Dehlin's supporters have publicly aired details of the deterioration of John Dehlin's relationship with Jenn Kamp. However, no evidence has been presented that John Dehlin directed or took any actions to encourage his supporters to engage in such conduct. Because Jenn Kamp did not meet her burden of demonstrating that stalking of Jenn Kamp by John Dehlin has occurred, the temporary civil stalking injunction issued on February 14, 2023 is hereby revoked. This is the order of the court, and no further writing is necessary to effectuate this decision. So ordered the 7th day of March, 2023, signed the Honorable Coral Sanchez, 3rd District Court. That is the end of the 13-page findings of fact and conclusions of law issued by Judge Coral Sanchez. We will see what the next step is by the parties. Whatever that step is, I will be here to report it to you. Well, that's about all for tonight. Until next time, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.